to identify investments as marketable or non-liquid, for example, Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, to value the inventory at lower of cost or market, for example, Celanese Corporation of America in 1931, to state the nature of miscellaneous reserves, for example, Hazel Atlas Glass Company, and to state the amount of the company's own securities held in the Treasury, for example, American Arch Company. Periodic reports to public agencies. Railroads and most public utilities are required to supply information to various federal and state commissions. Since these data are generally more detailed than the statements to shareholders, they afford a useful supplementary source of material. A few practical illustrations of the value of these reports to commissions may be of interest. For many years prior to 1927, Consolidated Gas Company of New York, now Consolidated Edison Company of New York, was a mystery stock in Wall Street because it supplied very little information to its stockholders. Great emphasis was laid by speculators upon the undisclosed value of its interest in its numerous subsidiary companies. However, complete operating and financial data relating to both the company and its subsidiaries were at all times available in the annual reports of the Public Service Commission of New York. The same situation pertained over a long period with respect to the McKay companies, controlling Postal Telegraph and Cable Corporation, which reported no details to its stockholders, but considerable information to the Interstate Commerce Commission. A similar contrast exists between the unilluminating reports of Fifth Avenue Bus Securities Company to its shareholders and the complete information filed by its operating subsidiary with the New York Transit Commission. Finally, we may mention the Standard Oil group of pipeline companies, which have been extremely chary of information to their stockholders. But these companies come under the jurisdiction of the Interstate Commerce Commission and are required to file circumstantial annual reports at Washington. Examination of these reports several years ago would have disclosed striking facts about these companies' holdings of cash and marketable securities. The voluminous data contained in the Survey of Current Business, published monthly by the United States Department of Commerce, have included sales figures for individual chain store companies which were not given general publicity. For example, Waldorf System, J.R. Thompson, United Cigar Stores, Hartman Corporation, etc. Current statistical information regarding particular companies is often available in trade publications or services. Examples: Cram's Auto Service gives weekly figures of production for each motor car company. Willett and Gray publish several estimates of sugar production by companies during the crop year. The Oil and Gas Journal often carries data regarding the production of important fields by companies. The Railway Age supplies detailed information regarding equipment orders placed. Dow Jones and Company estimate weekly the rate of production of United States Steel. Listing applications. In pre-SEC days, these were the most important non-periodic sources of information. The reports required by the New York Stock Exchange as a condition to admitting securities to its list are much more detailed than those usually submitted to the stockholders. The additional data may include sales in dollars, output in units, amount of federal taxes, details of subsidiaries' operations, basis and amount of depreciation and depletion charges. Valuable information may also be supplied regarding the properties owned, the terms of contracts, and the accounting methods followed. The analyst will find these listing applications exceedingly helpful. It is unfortunate that they appear at irregular intervals and therefore cannot be counted upon as a steady source of information. Registration statements and prospectuses. As a result of the SEC legislation and regulations, the information available regarding all listed securities and all new securities, whether listed or not, is much more comprehensive than heretofore. These data are contained in registration statements filed with the Commission in Washington and available for inspection or obtainable in copy upon payment of a fee. The more important information in the registration statement must be included in the prospectus supplied by the underwriters to intending purchasers of new issues. Similar registration statements must be filed with the SEC under the terms of the Public Utility Act of 1935, which applies to holding companies, some of which might not come under the other legislation. Although it is true that the registration statements are undoubtedly too bulky to be read by the typical investor, and although it is doubtful if he is even careful to digest the material in the abbreviated prospectus, which still may cover more than 100 pages, there is no doubt that this material is proving of the greatest value to the analyst and, through him, to the investing public. Miscellaneous official reports. Information on individual companies may be unearthed in various kinds of official documents. A few examples will give an idea of their miscellaneous character. The report of the United States Coal Commission in 1923, finally printed as a Senate document in 1925, gave financial and operating data on the anthracite companies which had not previously been published. Reports of the Federal Trade Commission have recently supplied a wealth of information heretofore not available concerning utility operating and holding companies and natural gas and pipeline companies, unearthed in an elaborate investigation extending over a period of about 9 years. In 1938 and 1939, the Commission published detailed reports on the farm implement and automobile manufacturers. In 1933, a comprehensive study of the pipeline companies was published under the direction of the House Committee on Interstate and Foreign Commerce. Voluminous studies of the American telephone and telegraph system have emanated from the investigation carried on by the Federal Communications Commission pursuant to a congressional resolution adopted in 1935. Some of the opinions of the Interstate Commerce Commission have contained material of great value to the analyst. Trustees under mortgages may have information required to be supplied by the terms of the indenture. These figures may be significant. For example, unpublished reports with the trustee of Mason City and Fort Dodge Railroad Company Fours revealed that the interest on the bonds was not being earned, that payment thereof was being continued by Chicago Great Western Railroad Company as a matter of policy only, and hence that the bonds were in a far more vulnerable position than was generally suspected. Statistical and financial publications. Most of the information required by the securities analyst in his daily work may be found conveniently and adequately presented by the various statistical services. These include comprehensive manuals published annually with periodic supplements, PORs, Moody's, descriptive stock and bond cards, and manuals frequently revised, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, daily digests of news relating to individual companies, Standard Corporation Records, Fitch. These services have made great progress during the past 20 years in the completeness and accuracy with which they present the facts. Nevertheless, they cannot be relied upon to give all the data available in the various original sources above described. Some of these sources escape them completely, and in other cases they may neglect to reproduce items of importance. It follows, therefore, that in any thoroughgoing study of an individual company, the analyst should consult the original reports and other documents whenever possible, and not rely upon summaries or transcriptions. In the field of financial periodicals, special mention must be made of the Commercial and Financial Chronicle, a weekly publication with numerous statistical supplements. Its treatment of the financial and industrial field is unusually comprehensive, and its most noteworthy feature is perhaps its detailed reproduction of corporate reports and other documents. Requests for direct information from the company. Published information may often be supplemented to an important extent by private inquiry of or by interview with the management. There is no reason why stockholders should not ask for information on specific points, and in many cases, part at least of the data asked for will be furnished. It must never be forgotten that a stockholder is an owner of the business and an employer of its officers. He is entitled not only to ask legitimate questions, but also to have them answered unless there is some persuasive reason to the contrary. Insufficient attention has been paid to this all-important point. The courts have generally held that a bona fide stockholder has the same right to full information as a partner in a private business. This right may not be exercised to the detriment of the corporation, but the burden of proof rests upon the management to show an improper motive behind the request, or that disclosure of the information would work an injury to the business. Compelling a company to supply information involves expensive legal proceedings, and hence few shareholders are in a position to assert their rights to the limit. Experience shows, however, that vigorous demands for legitimate information are frequently acceded to even by the most recalcitrant managements. This is particularly true when the information asked for is no more than that which is regularly published by other companies in the same field. Information regarding the industry. Statistical data respecting industries as a whole are available in abundance. The Survey of Current Business, published by the United States Department of Commerce, gives monthly figures on output, consumption, stocks, unfilled orders, etc. for many different lines. Annual data are contained in the Statistical Abstract, the World Almanac, and other compendiums. More detailed figures are available in the Biennial Census of Manufacturers. Many important summary figures are published at frequent intervals in the various trade journals. In these publications will be found also a continuous and detailed picture of the current and prospective state of the industry. Thus, it is usually possible for the analyst to acquire, without undue difficulty, a background of fairly complete knowledge of the history and problems of the industry with which he is dealing. In recent years, the leading statistical agencies have developed additional services containing basic surveys of the principal industrial groups, supplemented frequently by current data designed to keep the basic surveys up to date. Chapter 4. Distinctions between investment and speculation. General connotations of the term investment. Investment, or investing, like value in the famous dictum of Justice Brandeis, is a word of many meanings. Of these, three will concern us here. The first meaning, or set of meanings, relates to putting or having money in a business. A man invests $1,000 in opening a grocery store. The return on investment in the steel industry, including bonded debt and retained profits, averaged 2.40% during 1929 through 1938. The sense here is purely descriptive. It makes no distinctions and pronounces no judgments. Note, however, that it accepts rather than rejects the element of risk. The ordinary business investment is said to be made at the risk of the business. The second set of uses applies the term in a similar manner to the field of finance. In this sense, all securities are investments. We have investment dealers or brokers, investment companies or trusts, investment lists. Here again, no real distinction is made between investment and other types of financial operations such as speculation. It is a convenient omnibus word with perhaps an admixture of euphemism, that is, a desire to lend a certain respectability to financial dealings of miscellaneous character. Alongside of these two indiscriminate uses of the term investment has always been a third and more limited connotation, that of investment as opposed to speculation. That such a distinction is a useful one is generally taken for granted. It is commonly thought that investment in this special sense is good for everybody and at all times. Speculation, on the other hand, may be good or bad, depending on the conditions and the person who speculates. It should be essential, therefore, for anyone engaging in financial operations to know whether he is investing or speculating, and, if the latter, to make sure that his speculation is a justifiable one. The difference between investment and speculation, when the two are thus opposed, is understood in a general way by nearly everyone. But when we try to formulate it precisely, we run into perplexing difficulties. In fact, something can be said for the cynic's definition that an investment is a successful speculation and a speculation is an unsuccessful investment. It might be taken for granted that United States government securities are an investment medium, while the common stock, say of Radio Corporation of America, which between 1931 and 1935 had neither dividends, earnings, nor tangible assets behind it, must certainly be a speculation. Yet operations of a definitely speculative nature may be carried on in United States government bonds, for example by specialists who buy large blocks in anticipation of a quick rise. And, on the other hand, in 1929, Radio Corporation of America Common was widely regarded as an investment to the extent, in fact, of being included in the portfolios of leading investment trusts. It is certainly desirable that some exact and acceptable definition of the two terms be arrived at, if only because we ought, as far as possible, to know what we are talking about. A more forceful reason, perhaps, might be the statement that the failure properly to distinguish between investment and speculation was in large measure responsible for the market excesses of 1928 to 1929 and the calamities that ensued, as well as, we think, for much continuing confusion in the ideas and policies of would-be investors. On this account, we shall give the question a more thoroughgoing study than it usually receives. The best procedure might be first to examine critically the various meanings commonly intended in using the two expressions, and then to endeavor to crystallize therefrom a single sound and definite conception of investment. Distinctions commonly drawn between the two terms. The chief distinctions in common use may be listed in the following table. Investment: 1. In bonds. Speculation: in stocks. Investment: 2. Outright purchases. Speculation: purchases on margin. Investment: 3. For permanent holding. Speculation: for a quick turn. Investment: 4. For income. Speculation: for profit. Investment: 5. In safe securities. Speculation: in risky issues. The first four distinctions have the advantage of being entirely definite, and each of them also sets forth a characteristic which is applicable to the general run of investment or speculation. They are all open to the objection that in numerous individual cases the criterion suggested would not properly apply. 1. Bonds versus stocks. Taking up the first distinction, we find it corresponds to a common idea of investing as opposed to speculating, and that it also has the weight of at least one authority on investment who insists that only bonds belong in that category. The latter contention, however, runs counter to the well-nigh universal acceptance of high-grade preferred stocks as media of investment. Furthermore, it is most dangerous to regard the bond form as possessing inherently the credentials of an investment, for a poorly secured bond may not only be thoroughly speculative, but the most unattractive form of speculation as well. It is logically unsound, furthermore, to deny investment rating to a strongly entrenched common stock merely because it possesses profit possibilities. Even the popular view recognizes this fact, since at all times certain especially sound common stocks have been rated as investment issues and their purchasers regarded as investors and not as speculators. 2 and 3. Outright versus marginal purchases. Permanent versus temporary holding. The second and third distinctions relate to the customary method and intention, rather than to the innate character of investment and speculative operations. It should be obvious that buying a stock outright does not ipso facto make the transaction an investment. In truth, the most speculative issues, for example, penny mining stocks, must be purchased outright since no one will lend money against them. Conversely, when the American public was urged during the war to buy Liberty bonds with borrowed money, such purchases were nonetheless universally classed as investments. If strict logic were followed in financial operations, a very improbable hypothesis, the common practice would be reversed. The safer investment issues would be considered more suitable for marginal purchase, and the riskier, speculative commitments would be paid for in full. Similarly, the contrast between permanent and temporary holding is applicable only in a broad and inexact fashion. An authority on common stocks has defined an investment as any purchase made with the intention of holding it for a year or longer, but this definition is admittedly suggested by its convenience rather than its penetration. The inexactness of this suggested rule is shown by the circumstance that short-term investment is a well-established practice. Long-term speculation is equally well-established as a ruleful fact, when the purchaser holds on hoping to make up a loss, and it is also carried on to some extent as an intentional undertaking. 4 and 5. Income versus profit. Safety versus risk. The fourth and fifth distinctions also belong together, and so joined they undoubtedly come closer than the others to both a rational and a popular understanding of the subject. Certainly, through many years prior to 1928, the typical investor had been interested above all in safety of principal and continuance of an adequate income. However, the doctrine that common stocks are the best long-term investments has resulted in a transfer of emphasis from current income to future income, and hence inevitably to future enhancement of principal value. In its complete subordination of the income element to the desire for profit, and also in the prime reliance it places upon favorable developments expected in the future, the new era style of investment, as exemplified in the general policy of the investment trusts, is practically indistinguishable from speculation. In fact, this so-called investment can be accurately defined as speculation in the common stocks of strongly situated companies. It would undoubtedly be a wholesome step to go back to the accepted idea of income as the central motive in investment, leaving the aim toward profit or capital appreciation as the typical characteristic of speculation. But it is doubtful whether the true inwardness of investment rests even in this distinction. Examining standard practices of the past, we find some instances in which current income was not the leading interest of a bona fide investment operation. This was regularly true, for example, of bank stocks, which until recent years were regarded as the exclusive province of the wealthy investor. These issues returned a smaller dividend yield than did high-grade bonds, but they were purchased on the expectation that the steady growth in earnings and surplus would result in special distributions and increased principal value. In other words, it was the earnings accruing to the stockholder's credit rather than those distributed in dividends which motivated his purchase. Yet it would not appear to be sound to call this attitude speculative, for we should then have to contend that only the bank stocks, which paid out most of their earnings in dividends, and thus gave an adequate current return, could be regarded as investments, while those following the conservative policy of building up their surplus would therefore have to be considered speculative. Such a conclusion is obviously paradoxical, and because of this fact, it must be admitted that an investment in a common stock might conceivably be founded on its earning power, without reference to current dividend payments. Does this bring us back to the new era theory of investment? Must we say that the purchase of low-yielding industrial shares in 1929 had the same right to be called investment as the purchase of low-yielding bank stocks in pre-war days? The answer to this question should bring us to the end of our quest, but to deal with it properly, we must turn our attention to the fifth and last distinction in our list, that between safety and risk. This distinction expresses the broadest concept of all those underlying the term investment, but its practical utility is handicapped by various shortcomings. If safety is to be judged by the result, we are virtually begging the question and come perilously close to the cynic's definition of an investment as a successful speculation. Naturally, the safety must be posited in advance, but here again there is room for much that is indefinite and purely subjective. The racetrack gambler, betting on a sure thing, is convinced that his commitment is safe. The 1929 investor in high-priced common stocks also considered himself safe in his reliance upon future growth to justify the figure he paid and more. Standards of safety. The concept of safety can be really useful only if it is based on something more tangible than the psychology of the purchaser. The safety must be assured, or at least strongly indicated, by the application of definite and well-established standards. It was this point which distinguished the bank stock buyer of 1912 from the common stock investor of 1929. The former purchased at price levels which he considered conservative in the light of experience. He was satisfied, from his knowledge of the institution's resources and earning power, that he was getting his money's worth in full. If a strong speculative market resulted in advancing the price to a level out of line with these standards of value, he sold his shares and waited for a reasonable price to return before reacquiring them. Had the same attitude been taken by the purchaser of common stocks in 1928 through 1929, the term investment would not have been the tragic misnomer that it was. But in proudly applying the designation blue chips to the high-priced issues chiefly favored, the public unconsciously revealed the gambling motive at the heart of its supposed investment selections. These differed from the old-time bank stock purchases in the one vital respect that the buyer did not determine that they were worth the price paid by the application of firmly established standards of value. The market made up new standards as it went along, by accepting the current price, however high, as the sole measure of value. Any idea of safety based on this uncritical approach was clearly illusory and replete with danger. Carried to its logical extreme, it meant that no price could possibly be too high for a good stock, and that such an issue was equally safe after it had advanced to 200 as it had been at 25. A proposed definition of investment. This comparison suggests that it is not enough to identify investment with expected safety. The expectation must be based on study and standards. At the same time, the investor need not necessarily be interested in current income. He may at times legitimately base his purchase on a return which is accumulating to his credit and realized by him after a longer or shorter wait. With these observations in mind, we suggest the following definition of investment as one in harmony with both the popular understanding of the term and the requirements of reasonable precision. An investment operation is one which, upon thorough analysis, promises safety of principal and a satisfactory return. Operations not meeting these requirements are speculative. Certain implications of this definition are worthy of further discussion. We speak of an investment operation rather than an issue or purchase for several reasons. It is unsound to think always of investment character as inhering in an issue per se. The price is frequently an essential element, so that a stock, and even a bond, may have investment merit at one price level but not at another. Furthermore, an investment might be justified in a group of issues which would not be sufficiently safe if made in any one of them singly. In other words, diversification might be necessary to reduce the risk involved in the separate issues to the minimum consonant with the requirements of investment. This would be true in general of purchases of common stocks for investment. In our view, it is also proper to consider as investment operations certain types of arbitrage and hedging commitments which involve the sale of one security against the purchase of another. In these operations, the element of safety is provided by the combination of purchase and sale. This is an extension of the ordinary concept of investment, but one which appears to the writers to be entirely logical. The phrases thorough analysis, promises safety, and satisfactory return are all chargeable with indefiniteness, but the important point is that their meaning is clear enough to prevent serious misunderstanding. By thorough analysis we mean, of course, the study of the facts in the light of established standards of safety and value. An analysis that recommended investment in General Electric common at a price 40 times its highest recorded earnings merely because of its excellent prospects would be clearly ruled out as devoid of all quality of thoroughness. The safety sought in investment is not absolute or complete. The word means, rather, protection against loss under all normal or reasonably likely conditions or variations. A safe bond, for example, is one which could suffer default only under exceptional and highly improbable circumstances. Similarly, a safe stock is one which holds every prospect of being worth the price paid, except under quite unlikely contingencies. Where study and experience indicate that an appreciable chance of loss must be recognized and allowed for, we have a speculative situation. A satisfactory return is a wider expression than adequate income, since it allows for capital appreciation or profit as well as current interest or dividend yield. Satisfactory is a subjective term. It covers any rate or amount of return, however low, which the investor is willing to accept, provided he acts with reasonable intelligence. It may be helpful to elaborate our definition from a somewhat different angle, which will stress the fact that investment must always consider the price as well as the quality of the security. Strictly speaking, there can be no such thing as an investment issue in the absolute sense, that is, implying that it remains an investment regardless of price. In the case of high-grade bonds, this point may not be important, for it is rare that their prices are so inflated as to introduce serious risk of loss of principal. But in the common stock field, this risk may frequently be created by an undue advance in price, so much so, indeed, that in our opinion the great majority of common stocks of strong companies must be considered speculative during most of the time, simply because their price is too high to warrant safety of principal in any intelligible sense of the phrase. We must warn the reader that prevailing Wall Street opinion does not agree with us on this point, and he must make up his own mind which of us is wrong. Nevertheless, we shall embody our principle in the following additional criterion of investment. An investment operation is one that can be justified on both qualitative and quantitative grounds. The extent to which the distinction between investment and speculation may depend upon the underlying facts, including the element of price, rather than on any easy generalization, may be brought home in somewhat extreme fashion by two contrasting examples based upon General Electric special, that is, preferred stock, which occurred in successive months. Example 1. In December 1934, this issue sold at 12 3/4. It paid 6% on $10 par and was callable on any dividend date at 11. In spite of the preeminent quality of this issue, as far as safety of dividends was concerned, the buyer at 12 3/4 was speculating to the extent of more than 10% of his principal. He was virtually wagering that the issue would not be called for some years to come. As it happened, the issue was called that very month for redemption at $11 per share on April 15, 1935. Example 2. After the issue was called, the price promptly declined to 11. At that time, the issue offered an unusual opportunity for profitable short-term investment on margin. Brokers buying the shares at 11 without paying commission, say on January 15, 1935, could have borrowed $10 per share thereon at not more than 2% per annum. This operation would have netted a sure return at the rate of 40% per annum on the capital invested, as shown by the following calculation. Cost of 1,000 shares at 11 net, $11,000. Redeemed April 15, 1935 at 11 plus dividend, $11,150. Gross profit, $150. Less 3 months interest at 2% on $10,000, $50. Net profit, $100. Net profit of $100 on $1,000 in 3 months is equivalent to annual return of 40%. Needless to say, the safety and the resultant investment character of this unusual operation derived solely from the fact that the holder could count absolutely on the redemption of the shares in April 1935. The conception of investment advanced above is broader than most of those in common use. Under it, investment may conceivably, though not usually, be made in stocks, carried on margin, and purchased with the chief interest in a quick profit. In these respects, it would run counter to the first four distinctions which we listed at the outset. But to offset this seeming laxity, we insist on a satisfactory assurance of safety based on adequate analysis. We are thus led to the conclusion that the viewpoint of analysis and the viewpoint of investment are largely identical in their scope. Other aspects of investment and speculation. Relation of the future to investment and speculation. It may be said with some approximation to the truth that investment is grounded on the past, whereas speculation looks primarily to the future. But this statement is far from complete. Both investment and speculation must meet the test of the future. They are subject to its vicissitudes and are judged by its verdict. But what we have said about the analyst and the future applies equally well to the concept of investment. For investment, the future is essentially something to be guarded against rather than to be profited from. If the future brings improvement, so much the better, but investment as such cannot be founded in any important degree upon the expectation of improvement. Speculation, on the other hand, may always properly, and often soundly, derive its basis and its justification from prospective developments that differ from past performance. Types of investment. Assuming that the student has acquired a fairly clear concept of investment in the distinctive sense that we have just developed, there remains the confusing effect of the prevalent use of the term in the broader meanings referred to at the beginning of this chapter. It might be useful if some descriptive adjective were regularly employed, when care is needed, to designate the particular meaning intended. Let us tentatively suggest the following. 1. Business investment, referring to money put or held in a business. 2. Financial investment or investment generally, referring to securities generally. 3. Sheltered investment, referring to securities regarded as subject to small risk by reason of their prior claim on earnings or because they rest upon an adequate taxing power. 4. Analyst's investment, referring to operations that, upon thorough study, promise safety of principal and an adequate return. Evidently, these different types of investment are not mutually exclusive. A good bond, for example, would fall under all four headings. Unless we specify otherwise, we shall employ the word investment and its relatives in the sense of analyst's investment as developed in this chapter. Types of speculation. The distinction between speculation and gambling assumes significance when the activities of Wall Street are subjected to critical scrutiny. It is more or less the official position of the New York Stock Exchange that gambling represents the creation of risks not previously existing, for example, racetrack betting, whereas speculation applies to the taking of risks that are implicit in a situation and so must be taken by someone. A formal distinction between intelligent speculation and unintelligent speculation is no doubt open to strong theoretical objections, but we do think that it has practical utility. Thus, we suggest the following. 1. Intelligent speculation, the taking of a risk that appears justified after careful weighing of the pros and cons. 2. Unintelligent speculation, risk-taking without adequate study of the situation. In the field of general business, most well-considered enterprises would belong in the class of intelligent speculations as well as representing business investments in the popular sense. If the risk of loss is very small, an exceptional occurrence, a particular business venture may qualify as an analyst's investment in our special sense. On the other hand, many ill-conceived businesses must be called unintelligent speculations. Similarly, in the field of finance, a great deal of common stock buying is done with reasonable care and may be called intelligent speculation. A great deal also is done upon inadequate consideration and for unsound reasons and thus must be called unintelligent. In the exceptional case, a common stock may be bought on such attractive terms, qualitative and quantitative, as to set the inherent risk at a minimum and justify the title of analyst's investment. Investment and speculative components. A proposed purchase that cannot qualify as an analyst's investment automatically falls into the speculative category, but at times it may be useful to view such a purchase somewhat differently and to divide the price paid into an investment and a speculative component. Thus, the analyst, considering General Electric common at its average price of $38.1939, might conclude that up to, say, $25 per share is justified from the strict standpoint of investment value. The remaining $13 per share will represent the stock market's average appraisal of the company's excellent long-term prospects, including therein perhaps a rather strong psychological bias in favor of this outstanding enterprise. On the basis of such a study, the analyst would declare that the price of $38 for General Electric includes an investment component of some $25 per share and a speculative component of about $13 per share. If this is sound, it would follow that, at a price of $25 or less, General Electric common would constitute an analyst's investment completely. But above that price, the buyer should recognize that he is paying something for the company's very real speculative possibilities. Investment value, speculative value, and intrinsic value. The foregoing discussion suggests an amplification of what was said in Chapter 1 on the concept of intrinsic value, which was there defined as value justified by the facts. It is important to recognize that such value is by no means limited to value for investment, that is, to the investment component of total value, but may properly include a substantial component of speculative value, provided that such speculative value is intelligently arrived at. Hence, the market price may be said to exceed intrinsic value only when the market price is clearly the reflection of unintelligent speculation. Generally speaking, it is the function of the stock market and not of the analyst to appraise the speculative factors in a given common stock picture. To this important extent, the market, not the analyst, determines intrinsic value. The range of such an appraisal may be very wide, as illustrated by our former suggestion that the intrinsic value of J.I. Case common in 1933 might conceivably have been as high as $130 or as low as $30. At any point between these broad limits, it would have been necessary to accept the market's verdict, changeable as it was from day to day, as representing the best available determination of the intrinsic value of this volatile issue. Chapter 5. Classification of securities. Securities are customarily divided into the two main groups of bonds and stocks, with the latter subdivided into preferred stocks and common stocks. The first and basic division recognizes and conforms to the fundamental legal distinction between the creditor's position and the partner's position. The bondholder has a fixed and prior claim for principal and interest. The stockholder assumes the major risks and shares in the profits of ownership. It follows that a higher degree of safety should inhere in bonds as a class, while greater opportunity of speculative gain to offset the greater hazard is to be found in the field of stocks. It is this contrast of both legal status and investment character as between the two kinds of issues which provides the point of departure for the usual textbook treatment of securities. Objections to the conventional grouping. 1. Preferred stock grouped with common. While this approach is hallowed by tradition, it is open to several serious objections. Of these, the most obvious is that it places preferred stocks with common stocks, whereas, so far as investment practice is concerned, the former undoubtedly belong with bonds. The typical or standard preferred stock is bought for fixed income and safety of principal. Its owner considers himself not as a partner in the business, but as the holder of a claim ranking ahead of the interest of the partners, that is, the common stockholders. Preferred stockholders are partners or owners of the business only in a technical, legalistic sense, but they resemble bondholders in the purpose and expected results of their investment. 2. Bond form identified with safety. A weightier, though less patent objection to the radical separation of bonds from stocks is that it tends to identify the bond form with the idea of safety. Hence, investors are led to believe that the very name bond must carry some special assurance against loss. This attitude is basically unsound and, on frequent occasions, is responsible for serious mistakes and loss. The investor has been spared even greater penalties for this error by the rather accidental fact that fraudulent security promoters have rarely taken advantage of the investment prestige attaching to the bond form. It is true beyond dispute that bonds as a whole enjoy a degree of safety distinctly superior to that of the average stock. But this advantage is not the result of any essential virtue of the bond form. It follows from the circumstance that the typical American enterprise is financed with some honesty and intelligence and does not assume fixed obligations without a reasonable expectation of being able to meet them. But it is not the obligation that creates the safety, nor is it the legal remedies of the bondholder in the event of default. Safety depends upon and is measured entirely by the ability of the debtor corporation to meet its obligations. The bond of a business without assets or earning power would be every whit as valueless as the stock of such an enterprise. Bonds representing all the capital placed in a new venture are no safer than common stock would be and are considerably less attractive, for the bondholder could not possibly get more out of the company by virtue of his fixed claim than he could realize if he owned the business in full, free, and clear. This simple principle seems too obvious to merit statement, yet because of the traditional association of the bond form with superior safety, the investor has often been persuaded that by the mere act of limiting his return, he obtained an assurance against loss. 3. Failure of titles to describe issues with accuracy. The basic classification of securities into bonds and stocks, or even into three main classes of bonds, preferred stocks, and common stocks, is open to the third objection that in many cases these titles fail to supply an accurate description of the issue. This is the consequence of the steadily mounting percentage of securities which do not conform to the standard patterns, but instead modify or mingle the customary provisions. Briefly stated, these standard patterns are as follows. 1. The bond pattern comprises A. The unqualified right to a fixed interest payment on fixed dates. B. The unqualified right to repayment of a fixed principal amount on a fixed date. C. No further interest in assets or profits and no voice in the management. 2. The preferred stock pattern comprises A. A stated rate of dividend in priority to any payment on the common. Hence, full preferred dividends are mandatory if the common receives any dividend, but if nothing is paid on the common, the preferred dividend is subject to the discretion of the directors. B. The right to a stated principal amount in the event of dissolution in priority to any payments to the common stock. C. Either no voting rights or voting power shared with the common. 3. The common stock pattern comprises A. A pro rata ownership of the company's assets in excess of its debts and preferred stock issues. B. A pro rata interest in all profits in excess of prior deductions. C. A pro rata vote for the election of directors and for other purposes. Bonds and preferred stocks conforming to the above standard patterns will sometimes be referred to as straight bonds or straight preferred stocks. Numerous deviations from the standard patterns. However, almost every conceivable departure from the standard pattern can be found in greater or less profusion in the security markets of today. Of these, the most frequent and important are identified by the following designations: income bonds, convertible bonds, and preferred stocks, bonds and preferred stocks with stock purchase warrants attached, participating preferred stocks, common stocks with preferential features, non-voting common stock. Of recent origin is the device of making bond interest or preferred dividends payable either in cash or in common stock at the holder's option. The callable feature now found in most bonds may also be termed a lesser departure from the standard provision of fixed maturity of principal. Of less frequent and perhaps unique deviations from the standard patterns, the variety is almost endless. We shall mention here only the glaring instance of Great Northern Railway preferred stock, which for many years has been in all respects a plain common issue, and also the resort by Associated Gas and Electric Company to the insidious and highly objectionable device of bonds convertible into preferred stock at the option of the company, which are, therefore, not true bonds at all. More striking still is the emergence of completely distinctive types of securities so unrelated to the standard bond or stock pattern as to require an entirely different set of names. Of these, the most significant is the option warrant, a device which, during the years prior to 1929, developed into a financial instrument of major importance and tremendous mischief-making powers. The option warrants issued by a single company, American and Foreign Power Company, attained in 1929 an aggregate market value of more than $1 billion, a figure exceeding our national debt in 1914. A number of other newfangled security forms bearing titles such as allotment certificates and dividend participations could be mentioned. The peculiarities and complexities to be found in the present-day security list are added arguments against the traditional practice of pigeonholing and generalizing about securities in accordance with their titles. While this procedure has the merit of convenience and a certain rough validity, we think it should be replaced by a more flexible and accurate basis of classification. In our opinion, the criterion most useful for purposes of study would be the normal behavior of the issue after purchase. In other words, its risk and profit characteristics as the buyer or owner would reasonably view them. New classifications suggested. With this standpoint in mind, we suggest that securities be classified under the following three headings. Class 1. Securities of the fixed value type. Representative issue, a high-grade bond or preferred stock. Class 2. Senior securities of the variable value type. A. Well-protected issues with profit possibilities. Representative issue, a high-grade convertible bond. B. Inadequately protected issues. Representative issue, a lower-grade bond or preferred stock. Class 3 common stock type. Representative issue, a common stock. An approximation to the above grouping could be reached by the use of more familiar terms as follows. 1. Investment bonds and preferred stocks. 2. Speculative bonds and preferred stocks. A. Convertibles, etc. B. Low-grade senior issues. 3. Common stocks. The somewhat novel designations that we employ are needed to make our classification more comprehensive. This necessity will be clearer perhaps from the following description and discussion of each group. Leading characteristics of the three types. The first class includes issues of whatever title in which prospective change of value may fairly be said to hold minor importance. The owner's dominant interest lies in the safety of his principal, and his sole purpose in making the commitment is to obtain a steady income. In the second class, prospective changes in the value of the principal assume real significance. In Type A, the investor hopes to obtain the safety of a straight investment with an added possibility of profit by reason of a conversion right or some similar privilege. In Type B, a definite risk of loss is recognized, which is presumably offset by a corresponding chance of profit. Securities included in Group 2B will differ from the common stock type, Group 3, in two respects. 1. They enjoy an effective priority over some junior issue, thus giving them a certain degree of protection. 2. Their profit possibilities, however substantial, have a fairly definite limit, in contrast with the unlimited percentage of possible gain theoretically or optimistically associated with a fortunate common stock commitment. Issues of the fixed value type include all straight bonds and preferred stocks of high quality selling at a normal price. Besides these, there belong in this class 1. Sound convertible issues where the conversion level is too remote to enter as a factor in the purchase. Similarly for participating or warrant-bearing senior issues. 2. Guaranteed common stocks of investment grade. 3. Class A or prior common stocks occupying the status of a high-grade, straight preferred stock. On the other hand, a bond of investment grade which happens to sell at any unduly low price would belong in the second group, since the purchaser might have reason to expect and be interested in an appreciation of its market value. Exactly at what point the question of price fluctuation becomes material rather than minor is naturally impossible to prescribe. The price level itself is not the sole determining factor. A long-term 3% bond selling at 60 may have belonged in the fixed value class. For example, Northern Pacific Railway 3s due 2047 between 1922 and 1930, whereas a one-year maturity of any coupon rate selling at 80 would not, because in a comparatively short time it must either be paid off at a 20-point advance or else default and probably suffer a severe decline in market value. We must be prepared, therefore, to find marginal cases where the classification, as between Group 1 and Group 2, will depend on the personal viewpoint of the analyst or investor. Any issue which displays the main characteristics of a common stock belongs in Group 3, whether it is entitled common stock, preferred stock, or even bond. The case already cited of American Telephone and Telegraph Company convertible 4.5s, when selling about 200, provide an apposite example. The buyer or holder of the bond at so high a level was to all practical purposes making a commitment in the common stock, for the bond and stock would not only advance together but also decline together over an exceedingly wide price range. Still more definite illustration of this point was supplied by the Kruger and Toll participating debentures at the time of their sale to the public. The offering price was so far above the amount of their prior claim that their title had no significance at all, and could only have been misleading. These bonds were definitely of the common stock type. The opposite situation is met when issues, senior in name, sell at such low prices that the junior securities can obviously have no real equity, that is, ownership interest, in the company. In such cases, the low-priced bond or preferred stock stands virtually in the position of a common stock and should be regarded as such for purposes of analysis. A preferred stock selling at 10 cents on the dollar, for example, should be viewed not as a preferred stock at all, but as a common stock. On the one hand, it lacks the prime requisite of a senior security, viz., that it should be followed by a junior investment of substantial value. On the other hand, it carries all the profit features of a common stock, since the amount of possible gain from the current level is, for all practical purposes, unlimited. The dividing line between Groups 2 and 3 is as indefinite as that between Groups 1 and 2. Borderline cases can be handled without undue difficulty, however, by considering them from the standpoint of either category or of both. For example, should a 7% preferred stock selling at 30 be considered a low-priced senior issue or as the equivalent of a common stock? The answer to this question will depend partly on the exhibit of the company and partly on the attitude of the prospective buyer. If real value may conceivably exist in excess of the par amount of the preferred stock, the issue may be granted some of the favored status of a senior security. On the other hand, whether or not the buyer should consider it in the same light as a common stock may also depend on whether he would be amply satisfied with a possible 250% appreciation or is looking for even greater speculative gain. From the foregoing discussion, the real character and purpose of our classification should now be more evident. Its basis is not the title of the issue, but the practical significance of its specific terms and status to the owner. Nor is the primary emphasis placed upon what the owner is legally entitled to demand, but upon what he is likely to get or is justified in expecting under conditions which appear to be probable at the time of purchase or analysis. Part 2. Fixed Value Investments. Introduction to Part 2. Unshackling Bonds by Howard S. Marks. My first exposure to security analysis came in 1965. As a Wharton undergraduate, I was assigned readings from the masterwork of Benjamin Graham and David Dodd, by that time joined by editor Sidney Cottle. These were the early days when a career in investment management mostly meant working for a bank, a trust company, or an insurance company. The first institutional investment boutique that I remember, Jennison Associates, was still a few years away from its founding. Common stock investors referenced the Dow Jones Industrial Average, not the Standard & Poor's 500 or the Russell 3000, and there was no ranking of investment managers' performance by percentile. In fact, it was just a few years earlier at the University of Chicago's Center for Research in Security Prices that stock prices since 1926 had been digitized manually, permitting calculation of the 9.2% historic return on equities. The term growth stock investing was relatively new, and in its absence, there had been no need for the contrasting term value investing. Hedge funds had yet to become a topic of popular discourse, and I'm not sure the term even existed. No one had ever heard of a venture capital fund, a private equity fund, an index fund, a quant fund, or an emerging markets fund. Even famous investor was largely an oxymoron. Warren Buffett hadn't yet become a celebrity, for example, and only a small circle of investing cognoscenti recognized the name of his teacher at Columbia, Ben Graham. The world of fixed income bore little resemblance to that of today. There was no way for bondholders to avoid uncertainty regarding the rate at which interest payments could be reinvested because zero-coupon bonds had not been invented. Bonds rated below investment grade couldn't be issued as such. Rating agency Moody's described a B-rated bond as fails to possess the characteristics of a desirable investment. The low-rated bonds that were outstanding were fallen angels, former investment-grade bonds whose issuers had gotten into trouble and had been downgraded, and they had yet to be labeled junk or high-yield bonds. Of course, there were no leveraged loans, mortgage-backed securities, MBSs, or collateralized bond, debt, and loan obligations. Today's bond professionals might give some thought to how their predecessors arrived at yields to maturity before the existence of computers, calculators, or Bloomberg terminals. I'm lucky to have begun my studies in the mid-1960s because the finance and investment theory I would go on to learn at the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business was new and hadn't yet spread broadly. Thus, my time spent at Wharton didn't include exposure to the efficient market hypothesis, which told the next few generations of students of finance that there was no use for security analysis, a guidebook to the impossible task of beating the market. I learned a lot from this book, which was generally accepted in 1965 as the Bible of security analysis, and still is. Yet I came away with a negative reaction as well, feeling that it contained too much dogma and too many formulas incorporating numerical constants like multiply by X or count only Y years. My recent rereading of the chapters on fixed income securities in the 1940 edition of Security Analysis served to remind me of some of the rules I had found too rigid. But it also showed me the vast wealth of less quantitative and more flexible common sense the book contained, as well as some of the forward-looking insights. To my mind, some of the most interesting aspects of the book and of developments in the investment world over the last several decades are seen in Graham and Dodd's perspective on the evolution of investment standards. At least through 1940, there were well-accepted and very specific criteria for what was proper and what was not, especially in fixed income. Laws, rules, and traditions governed the actions of fiduciaries and the things they could and could not do. In this environment, a fiduciary who lost money for beneficiaries in a non-qualifying investment could be surcharged, forced to make good the losses, without reference to how well they did their job overall or whether the whole portfolio made money. Understandably, these conditions caused a strong emphasis on excluding risky assets from fiduciary portfolios. Subsequently, the law accepted the concept of the prudent man based on a 19th century court case. The test now was whether this was something a prudent person would do, judged in the light of the circumstances under which the decision was made and in the context of the portfolio as a whole. Thus, individual losing investments need not give rise to penalties if the fiduciary's decisions and results were acceptable in toto. The prudent man rule was highly evolved in comparison to the outright ban on risk-taking that had preceded it. Harry Markowitz was a leading contributor to the finance theory we attribute to Chicago School. In the 1950s, based on the risk presented by highly correlated assets, he pointed out that the addition of a risky asset to a portfolio can reduce the portfolio's overall riskiness by increasing its diversification. Finally, the ultimate contribution of the Chicago School came through the assertion that the goodness of an investment and of a performance record should be evaluated based on the relationship between its return and its risk. A safe investment is not necessarily a good investment, and a risky investment is not necessarily a bad investment. Good enough performance prospects can compensate for the riskiness of a risky investment, rendering it both attractive and prudent. Through this process, the practice of investing evolved from risk avoidance to risk management. Today, we see few absolute rules of investing. In fact, it's hard to think of anything that's off limits, and most investors will do almost anything to make a buck. The 1940 edition of Security Analysis marks an interesting turn toward what we would consider very modern thinking. It references some absolute standards, but dismisses many others and reflects an advanced attitude toward sensible fixed income investing. Investment absolutes. The 1940 edition certainly contains statements that seem inflexible. Here are some examples. Deficient safety cannot be compensated for by an abnormally high coupon rate. The selection of all bonds for investment should be subject to rules of exclusion and to specific quantitative tests. If a company's junior bonds are not safe, its first mortgage bonds are not a desirable fixed value investment. For if the second mortgage is unsafe, the company itself is weak, and generally speaking, there can be no high-grade obligations of a weak enterprise. Bonds of smaller industrial companies are not well qualified for consideration as fixed value investments. When I began to manage high-yield bonds in 1978, most institutional portfolios were governed by rules that limited bond holdings to either investment grade, rated BBB or better, or A or better. Rules like these, which put certain securities off limits to most buyers regardless of price, had the effect of making bargains available to the few of us who weren't so restricted. At first glance, Graham and Dodd's proscriptions would seem to be among those rules. Investment versus speculation. As I reread the chapters in this edition, I came across several statements like these to the effect that some bond is or is not appropriate for investment. No mention of price or yield, just yes or no, good or bad. To someone whose career in portfolio management has dealt almost exclusively with below investment grade assets, this would seem to rule out whole sections of the investment universe. The idea is that potential return can compensate for risk, and that the debt of a financially troubled company can become so cheap that it's a screaming buy appear to fight the author's principles. Then I looked again, and it dawned on me that Graham and Dodd were saying one thing and I was reading another, and that a good deal of the gap was a matter of language. Graham and Dodd didn't mean that something shouldn't be bought, but rather that it shouldn't be bought, to use their phrase, on an investment basis. That was an important distinction 80 years ago. Today, people attach the word investment to anything purchased for the purpose of financial gain, as opposed to something bought for use or consumption. People invest today in not just stocks and bonds, but also in jewelry, vacation home timeshares, collectibles, art, and cryptocurrencies. But 80 years ago, investing meant something very different: the purchase of financial assets that, by their intrinsic nature, satisfied the requirements of conservatism, prudence, and above all, safety. In particular, investing was differentiated from speculating, a word we rarely hear these days. Among the online definitions for speculation, I found secondary definitions like this one: to engage in any business transaction involving considerable risk or the chance of large gains, especially to buy and sell commodities, stocks, etc., in the expectation of a quick or very large profit. Dictionary.com. To me, that definition doesn't provide a sufficient sense for what distinguishes speculating from investing. I think it's more helpful to look to primary definitions for speculation that aren't confined to the word's application in investing. To think about something and make guesses about it. To form ideas or theories about something, usually when there are many things not known about it. Britannica.com/dictionary. And reasoning based on inconclusive evidence, conjecture, or supposition. thefreedictionary.com. Perhaps a full appreciation for the word can best be derived from some of the synonyms offered by Merriam-Webster: chance, gamble, flyer, and crapshoot. In Graham and Dodd's day, securities qualified for investment on the basis of quality, not prospective return. They either were of high enough quality to be eligible for investment or they weren't. In the extreme, there were hard and fast rules, such as those promulgated by each of the states for its savings banks. In New York, for example, savings banks could buy railroad, gas, and electric bonds, but not the bonds of streetcar railway or water companies. Bonds secured by first mortgages on real estate qualified as investments, but startlingly, industrial bonds did not. Investments that hewed to the accepted standards were considered safe, and probably litigation-proof for the fiduciary who bought them, while speculating was chancy. It was this rigid, exclusionary black-and-white attitude toward investment propriety that likely led John Maynard Keynes to his trenchant observation that a speculator is one who runs risks of which he is aware, and an investor is one who runs risks of which he is unaware. A more modern attitude, and like Keynes's, well ahead of its time, would be based on the notion that virtually any asset can be a good investment if bought knowledgeably and at a low enough price. The opposite is also something that I insist is true. There is no asset so good that it can't be a bad investment if bought at too high a price. Everyone now realizes that membership on a list of acceptable investments certainly doesn't provide protection against loss. If you don't agree with that statement, try looking for the 40 or so corporate bonds that were rated AAA when I was in college, or the enormous numbers of tranched mortgage-backed securities that received AAA ratings in the lead-up to the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, but were downgraded and eventually recovered less than par. In security analysis, the principle is developed and reiterated that a high coupon rate is not adequate compensation for the assumption of substantial risk of principal. This statement would seem to rule out investing in high-yield bonds, which has been successfully pursued over the last 45 years with absolute and risk-adjusted returns well above those on investment-grade bonds. A more thorough reading, however, shows that securities that the authors say should not be purchased on an investment basis can still be considered for speculation. Nevertheless, today Graham and Dodd's blanket statement certainly seems doctrinaire, especially in that it implements a distinction that has almost entirely ceased to exist. The statement that certain assets either are or are not appropriate for purchase on an investment basis is probably one of the dicta to which I reacted negatively 57 years ago. But now, in this rereading, I was able to see further. Investment realism. Over the last 5 or 6 decades, the investment world has seen the development of what could be described as a much more pragmatic approach to making money. judging investment merit not on absolute notions of quality and safety or on descriptions such as investment grade or speculative, but rather on the relationship between expected return and expected risk. Alternatively, of course, this could be described as a lowering of standards, whatever happened to concepts like fiduciary duty and preservation of capital. Graham and Dodd seem to operate in a middle ground. They propound absolute requirements for purchases on an investment basis, but they also admit that apparent quality and safety alone shouldn't be expected to make some things successful investments or rule out others. Here are several examples. Given that fixed income securities lack the upside potential of equities, the essence of proper bond selection consists, therefore, in obtaining specific and convincing factors of safety in compensation for the surrender of participation in profits. Fixed income investing can't be expected to work if creditworthiness isn't there. The conception of a mortgage lien as a guarantee of protection independent of the success of the business itself is in most cases a complete fallacy. The established practice of stating the original cost or appraised value of the pledged property as an inducement to purchase bonds is entirely misleading. To be creditworthy, securities must be backed by cash flows or assets with real current value. The debentures, unsecured bonds, of a strong enterprise are undoubtedly sounder investments than the mortgage issues of a weak company. Labels alone mean nothing. It is clear that the investor who favors the Kudahai first lien 5s yielding 5.5 versus the junior 5.5s yielding over 20% is paying a premium of about 15% per annum, the difference in yield, for only a partial insurance against loss. On this basis, he is undoubtedly giving up too much for what he gets in return. On the other hand, where the first mortgage bond yields only slightly less, it is undoubtedly wise to pay the small insurance premium for protection against unexpected trouble. What matters is the relationship between the risk borne and the potential return to be received. In reviewing bond collapses among railroads between 1931 and 1933, the fault appears to be that the stability of the transportation industry was overrated, so that investors were satisfied with a margin of protection which proved insufficient. It was not a matter of imprudently disregarding old established standards of safety, but of being content with old standards when conditions called for more stringent requirements. If the investor had required his railroad bonds to meet the same tests that he applied to industrial issues, he would have been compelled to confine his selection to a relatively few of the strongly situated lines. As it turned out, nearly all of these have been able to withstand the tremendous loss of traffic since 1929 without danger to their fixed charges. Issuers can't be assumed to be stable and unchanging. The potential for deterioration and disruption must be considered, certainly now more than ever. It is clear that Graham and Dodd are insistent on substance over form, and on logic rather than rules. Credit standards must not be fixed, but instead must change as the world changes. It's how likely a bond is to pay that matters, not what it's labeled. Mortgages are not automatically better than unsecured debentures. Senior bonds are not necessarily better buys than their juniors. Superior yield can render riskier issues more attractive than ostensibly safer ones. Although the stilted language of 80 years ago initially masks this point, a thorough reading makes it clear that Graham and Dodd are true investment pragmatists. More echoing Keynes than diverging from him, they argue for in-depth analysis followed by intelligent risk-bearing, as opposed to knee-jerk risk avoidance. Our methodology for bond investing. To examine the relevance of security analysis to fixed income investments, I reviewed Graham and Dodd's process for bond investing, and I compared their approach to the one applied by my firm, Oak Tree Capital Management, LP. The bottom line is that, while Graham and Dodd's thoughts may be expressed differently, most are highly applicable to today's investment world. In fact, they strongly parallel the approach and methodology developed and applied in the area of high-yield bonds over the last 45 years by my partner, Sheldon Stone, and me. 1. Our entire approach is based on recognition of the asymmetry that underlies all non-distressed bond investing. Gains on fixed income securities are limited to the promised yield plus perhaps a few points of appreciation, while credit losses can cause most or all of one's principal to be lost. The key to success lies in avoiding losers, not in searching for winners. As Graham and Dodd note, instead of associating bonds primarily with the presumption of safety, it would be sounder to start with what is not presumption but fact, viz., that a straight bond is an investment with limited return. Our primary conception of the bond as a commitment with limited return leads us to another important viewpoint toward bond investment. Since the chief emphasis must be placed on avoidance of loss, bond selection is primarily a negative art. It is a process of exclusion and rejection rather than of search and acceptance. 2. Our high-yield bond portfolios are tightly focused. We work mostly in that part of the curve that we consider the sweet spot, centered around B-rated bonds where healthy yields can be earned and the risk of default is limited. For us, higher-rated bonds don't have enough yield and lower-rated bonds have too much uncertainty. This single B zone is where our clients expect us to operate. Of course, we have to be ready to alter our focus should risk-return relationships change. It would be sounder procedure to start with minimum standards of safety, which all bonds must be required to meet. Essentially, bond selection should consist of working upward from definite minimum standards rather than working downward in haphazard fashion from some ideal but overly restrictive level of maximum security. 3. Credit risk stems primarily from the quantum of leverage and the firm's basic instability, the interaction of which in tough times can erode the margin by which interest coverage exceeds debt service requirements. A company with very stable cash flows can support high leverage and heavy debt service. By the same token, a company with limited leverage and modest debt service requirements can survive severe fluctuations in its cash flow. But the combination of high leverage and undependable cash flow can result in a failure to service debt, as investors are reminded painfully from time to time. Graham and Dodd cite the very same elements. Studying the 1931 to 1933 record, we note that price collapses among industrial bonds were not due primarily to unsound financial structures, as in the case of utility bonds, nor to a miscalculation by investors as to the margin of safety needed, as in the case of railroad bonds. We are confronted, in many cases, by a sudden disappearance of earning power and a disconcerting question as to whether the business can survive. 4. Analysis of individual issues calls for a multifaceted approach. Since 1985, my team of analysts has applied an 8-factor credit analysis process developed by Sheldon Stone. Most of the elements are reflected in, perhaps ultimately were inspired by, aspects of Graham and Dodd's thinking. Our concerns are with industry, companies standing within the industry, quality of management, interest coverage, capital structure, alternative sources of liquidity, liquidation value, and covenants. Security analysis reflects many of these same concerns. On company standing, the experience of the past decade indicates that dominant or at least substantial size affords an element of protection against the hazards of instability. On interest coverage, the present-day investor is accustomed to regard the ratio of earnings to interest charges as the most important specific test of safety. On capital structure, the biggest company may be the weakest if its bonded debt is disproportionately large. 5. Buy and hold investing is inconsistent with the responsibilities of the professional investor, and the creditworthiness of every issuer represented in the portfolio must be revisited no less than quarterly. Even before the market collapse of 1929, the danger ensuing from neglect of investments previously made and the need for periodic scrutiny or supervision of all holdings had been recognized as a new canon in Wall Street. This principle, directly opposed to the former practice, is frequently summed up in the dictum, "There are no permanent investments." 6. Don't engage in market timing based on economic and interest rate forecasts. Instead, we confine our efforts to knowing the knowable, which can result only from superior efforts to understand industries, companies, and securities. It is doubtful if trading in bonds to catch the market swings can be carried on successfully by the investor. We are skeptical of the ability of any paid agency to provide reliable forecast of the market action of either bonds or stocks. Furthermore, we are convinced that any combined effort to advise upon the choice of individual high-grade investments and upon the course of bond prices is fundamentally illogical and confusing. Much as the investor would like to be able to buy at just the right time and sell out when prices are about to fall, experience shows that he is not likely to be brilliantly successful in such efforts, and that by injecting the trading element into his investment operations, he will inevitably shift his interest into speculative directions. 7. Despite our best efforts, defaults will creep into our portfolios, whether due to failings in credit analysis or bad luck. For the incremental yield gained from taking risks to regularly exceed the losses incurred as a result of defaults, individual holdings must be small enough so that a single default won't dissipate a large amount of the portfolio's capital. We have always thought of our approach to risk as being akin to that of an insurance company. In order for the actuarial process to work, the risk must be spread over many small holdings and the expected return given a chance to prove out. Thus, you should not invest in high-yield bonds unless your portfolio can be thoroughly diversified. The individual investor cannot prudently turn himself into an insurance company and incur risks of losing his principal in exchange for annual premiums in the form of extra-large interest coupons. One objection to such a policy is that sound insurance practice requires a very wide distribution of risk in order to minimize the influence of luck and to allow maximum play to the law of probability. The investor may endeavor to attain this end by diversifying his holdings, but as a practical matter, he cannot approach the division of risk attained by an insurance company. To wrap up the subject of investment approach, we feel the successful assumption of credit risk in the fixed income universe depends on the successful assessment of the company's future ability to service its debts. Extensive financial statement analysis is not nearly as important as a few skilled judgments regarding the company's prospects. The selection of a fixed value security for limited income returns should be relatively, at least, a simple operation. The investor must make certain by quantitative tests that the income has been amply above the interest charges and that the current value of the business is well in excess of its debts. In addition, he must be satisfied in his own judgment that the character of the enterprise is such as to promise continued success in the future, or, more accurately speaking, to make failure a highly unlikely occurrence. In the end, though, we diverge from Graham and Dodd in one important way. In selecting bonds for purchase, we make judgments about the issuer's prospects, and here's why. When I began to analyze and manage high-yield bonds in 1978, the widely held view was that investing in bonds and assessing the future are fundamentally incompatible, and that prudent bond investing must be based on solid inferences drawn from past and present data, as opposed to speculation regarding future events. But credit risk is prospective, and thus substantial credit risk can be borne intelligently only on the basis of skilled judgments about the future. In large part, the old position represented a prejudice that buying stocks, an inherently riskier proposition, can be done intelligently on the basis of judgments regarding the future. But depending on those same judgments in the more conservative world of bond investing just isn't right. Some of the greatest and most profitable market inefficiencies I have encountered have been the result of prejudices that walled off certain opportunities from proper investing, and thus left them for flexible investors to pick off at prices far below their fair value. This seems to be one of those prejudices. One of the reasons I was chosen to start First National City Bank's high-yield bond operation in 1978 was my immediately prior experience as the bank's director of research for equities. All I had to do then was apply the future-oriented process for analyzing common stocks to the universe of bonds rated below BBB. Few walls still stand in the investment world today, and it is widely understood that forward-looking analysis can be profitably applied to instruments of all sorts. That lesson remained to be learned in 1940. Common sense. Much of the value of security analysis lies not in its specific instructions, but in its common sense. Several of its lessons have specific relevance to the present. More important, Graham and Dodd's insight and thought process show how investors should try to dig beneath customary, superficial answers to investment questions. Security prices and yields are not determined by any exact mathematical calculation of the expected risk, but they depend rather upon the popularity of the issue. Markets are not clinically efficient. It may be pointed out further that the supposed actuarial computation of investment risks is out of the question theoretically as well as in practice. There are no experience tables available by which the expected mortality of various types of issues can be determined. Even if such tables were prepared based on long and exhaustive studies of past records, it is doubtful whether they would have any real utility for the future. In life insurance, the relation between age and mortality rate is well defined and changes only gradually. The same is true to a much lesser extent of the relation between the various types of structures and the fire hazard attaching to them. But the relation between different types of investments and the risk of low loss is entirely too indefinite and too variable with changing conditions to permit of sound mathematical formulation. This is particularly true because investment losses are not distributed fairly evenly in point of time, but tend to be concentrated at intervals, that is, during periods of general depression. Hence, the typical investment hazard is roughly similar to the conflagration or epidemic hazard, which is the exceptional and incalculable factor in fire or life insurance. So much for assessing risk and the adequacy of return on the basis of supposedly reliable quantitative models. Among the aspects of the earnings picture to which the investor would do well to pay attention are the trend, the minimum figure, and the current figure. The importance of each of these cannot be gainsaid, but they do not lend themselves effectively to the application of hard and fast rules. The investor will be attracted by A. a rising trend in profits, B. an especially good current showing, and C. a satisfactory margin over interest charges in every year during the period studied. If a bond is deficient in any one of these three aspects, the result should not necessarily be to condemn the issue, but rather to exact an average earnings coverage well in excess of the minimum and to require closer attention to the general or qualitative elements in the situation. If a ratio of $1 of stock to $1 of bonds is taken as the normal requirement for an industrial company, would it not be sound to demand, say, a $2 to $1 ratio when stock prices are inflated, and conversely to be satisfied with a 50-cent to $1 ratio when quotations are far below intrinsic values? But this suggestion is impracticable for two reasons. The first being that it implies that the bond buyer can recognize an unduly high or low level of stock prices, which is far too complimentary an assumption. The second is that it would require bond investors to act with a special caution when things are booming and with greater confidence when times are hard. This is a counsel of perfection which it is not in human nature to follow. Bond buyers are people, and they cannot be expected to escape entirely either the enthusiasm of bull markets or the apprehensions of a severe depression. In the purely speculative field, the objection to paying for advice is that if the advisor knew whereof he spoke, he would not need to bother with a consultant's duties. This isn't much different from Warren Buffett's observation that Wall Street is the only place that people ride to in a Rolls-Royce to get advice from those who take the subway. There are many instances in which Graham and Dodd offer common-sense advice, or even more interestingly, in which they refute existing rules of investing, substituting common sense for accepted wisdom, that great oxymoron. To me, this represents the greatest strength of the section on fixed income securities. In the end, Graham and Dodd remind us, investment theory should be chary of easy generalizations. Security analysis through the years. Many of Graham and Dodd's specific ideas have withstood the test of time and, in fact, been picked up and carried forward by others. Their observation that an investor may reject any number of good bonds with virtually no penalty at all may have inspired Warren Buffett, who draws a very apt comparison to batters in baseball. Buffett reportedly commented that a baseball hitter will be called out if he fails to swing at 3 pitches in the strike zone, while an investor can let any number of investment opportunities go by without being penalized. Likewise, Graham and Dodd submitted that the best criterion that we are able to offer for the purpose of assessing the margin of assets over indebtedness is the ratio of the market value of the capital stock to the total funded debt. This was paralleled by the market-adjusted debt, MAD, ratios popularized by Michael Milken when he pioneered the issuance of high-yield bonds at Drexel Burnham Lambert in the 1970s and 1980s. Market values are far from perfect, but accounting data are purely historical and are often out of date at best and irrelevant at worst. Importantly, Graham and Dodd highlight the importance of cash flow stability in a company's ability to service its debts in an adverse environment. Once it is admitted, as it always must be, that the industry can suffer some reduction in profits, then the investor is compelled to estimate the possible extent of the shrinkage and compare it with the surplus above the interest requirements. He thus finds himself vitally concerned with the ability of the company to meet the vicissitudes of the future. This consideration contributed to the fact that, in its infancy in the mid-1970s, the leveraged buyout industry restricted its purchases to non-cyclical companies and avoided high-tech firms. Like all important investment principles, this one is often ignored in bullish periods, as enthusiasm and optimism gain sway and the stable cash flow rule can be easily forgotten. Additional thoughts. In considering the relevance 83 years later of the 1940 edition of Security Analysis, a number of additional observations deserve to be made. First, most of the timing that interested Graham and Dodd concerned depressions and their impact on creditworthiness. They cite 3 depressions, 1920 to 1922, 1930 to 1933, and 1937 to 1938, whereas we talk today about there having been only one in the 20th century, the Great Depression. Clearly, Graham and Dodd included under this heading what we call recessions. Second, they were not concerned with predicting interest rate fluctuations. A primary reason for this may be that interest rates didn't fluctuate as much in those days. A table on page 157 shows, for example, that in the 13 years from 1926 to 1938, a period that sandwiched a famous boom between 2 depressions, the yield on 40 utility bonds moved only between 3.9% and 6.3%. At the time the 1940 edition was published, interest rates had been low and fairly steady for years. Third, it is important to note that several of Graham and Dodd's warnings against risk-taking are directed not at professionals, but at the individual investors who appear to have been the author's target audience. As a practical matter, it is not so easy to distinguish in advance between the underlying bonds that come through reorganization unscathed and those which suffer drastic treatment. Hence, the ordinary investor may be well advised to leave such issues out of his calculations and stick to the rule that only strong companies have strong bonds. The individual is not qualified to be an insurance underwriter. It is not his function to be paid for incurring risks. On the contrary, it is to his interest to pay others for insurance against loss, even assuming that the high coupon rates on higher yielding securities will, in the great aggregate, more than compensate on an actuarial basis for the risks accepted. Such bonds are still undesirable investments from the personal standpoint of the average investor. Thus, concern for the safety of non-professional investors appears to be at the root of many of security analysis' most rigid dicta. I would not differ with the proposition that direct investment in distressed debt and high-yield bonds should be left to professionals. If they want exposure to this market sector, as well as to many others, people lacking the necessary expertise would be best off investing in diversified high-yield bond ETFs or some other vehicle for investing passively. An evolving market. The investing world is mainly about money, of course. Companies need financing to operate, and in obtaining it, they look to minimize cost and maximize flexibility. Investment bankers are in business to aid in that process for a fee. Investors supply the needed capital, and they look to earn returns and outperform other investors. Investment managers invest the capital of their clients also for a fee. All parties are financially motivated. The human mind is a creative organ, always looking for something better, faster, and more profitable. Given the high level of motivation, considerable brain power is applied to financial challenges, and the result is financial innovation. Wall Street constantly invents new securities and techniques, which are regularly heralded as seminal advances and surefire solutions. Some prove out when tested in hostile economic environments, and some are defrocked. Because of this tendency toward evolution, the fixed income market of today is nearly unrecognizable from what it looked like when the 1940 edition of Security Analysis was written. Even in just the period since 2009, when I first updated the section on fixed value investing for a new edition, our markets have continued to evolve. For those who are intellectually curious and interested in new subjects to conquer, this is one of the great benefits of being an investor. I described the transition of investing from the rules-bound pursuit of quality and safety to the flexible maximization of risk-adjusted returns, and thus from risk avoidance to the intelligent bearing of risk for profit. These developments have contributed to substantial change in the fixed income markets in ways Graham and Dodd could never have foreseen. I want to close this section by describing some of them. Fixed value is the term Graham and Dodd used to describe investing in debt securities. Over time, that morphed into fixed income. Even that latter term is heard less often these days, perhaps because the popularity of floating rate securities and the importance of changes in creditworthiness have rendered our turf much less fixed. Today, the term we hear more often is credit, which refers to all fixed income securities other than debt of governments. The term credit might be viewed as shorthand for debt where the issuer's creditworthiness matters. A reminder that repayment is less than 100% certain in non-government securities, more so in some cases than others. When I joined First National Citibank in 1969, the fixed income securities we heard about most were bonds. They were overseen there by two bond veterans. Their area became a backwater as equities soared, and they ceased publishing bond data when their readership disappeared in the 1970s. Investment-grade bonds were paid little attention over the next few decades. Attention was paid, however, to the high-yield or sub-investment-grade bonds that began to be issued around 1977 to 1978. These securities offered yields well above those on investment-grade bonds. They financed a new industry in leveraged buyouts, now called private equity, and they exemplified the practice of buying risky securities if they appear to offer more than commensurate returns. Prior to the turn of the century, the word loans mostly meant bank loans, which the lead bank originated and perhaps syndicated to, that is, shared with, a few other banks. Publicly issued senior loans, leveraged loans, or floating rate loans began to appear in the early 2000s. These new debt securities are issued by non-investment grade companies just like high-yield bonds, are senior in rank, not subordinated, provide yields that are slightly below those on high-yield bonds due to their seniority, and are characterized by interest rates that float, tied to benchmarks such as LIBOR or SOFR. Most banks were chastened in the global financial crisis and tightly regulated afterward, such that they were less willing to lend money. This created a vacuum which non-bank lenders began to fill around 2011. As a result, private debt or direct lending has become an important asset class, entailing illiquidity, but also higher interest rates in compensation therefor. Many of the innovations in credit brought hopes for increased absolute returns or risk-adjusted returns. However, many of those perceived improvements were accompanied by declines in marketability or liquidity. In times of market upset, selling lower-grade debt securities is more difficult and entails accepting big discounts from the previous price. Private debt is, by definition, saleable only in off-market transactions, which can become hard to engineer in tough times. In the past, bonds were considered more prone to price fluctuation the more time remaining to maturity. More recently, bond investors' focus has shifted from maturity to duration, or the number of years until half the discounted value of the future cash flows will have been realized. Because bondholders must wait longer on average to get cash from a 2% 10-year bond than from a 10% 10-year bond, for example, the 2% bond has a longer duration and is expected to fluctuate more in response to a given change in interest rates, even though its maturity is the same. Because of the role of the ups and downs of interest rates in causing bond depreciation and appreciation, until 20 to 30 years ago, many bond investors were interest rate anticipators, predicting interest rate movements based on the business cycle. Now they pay more attention to the actions of the Federal Reserve and to corporate developments because more debt securities come from low-grade companies and thus are greatly affected by changes in their issuers' creditworthiness. In the distant past, bonds were bought primarily to diversify portfolios and provide steady income. Today, many people buy them for total return and or trade them actively for short-term profits, just as with equities. Today, given that investors care about total return, the distinction between income and appreciation is accorded less importance. People are perfectly happy spending some of the appreciation on securities that don't provide income, and income is often retained in the hope of generating subsequent appreciation. These days, debt securities aren't only purchased but also sold short to bet on negative developments or arbitraged to take advantage of price anomalies. Today, an investor can place bets on the future direction of interest rates, the broad debt market, or subsets of the market without ever transacting in debt securities themselves. Rather, investment banks are happy to sell derivatives, baskets, and synthetics that mirror the performance of the assets in question. Recent decades have brought the creation of structured or tranched debt securities. These include securities backed by mortgages on residential or commercial properties, asset-backed securities collateralized by things such as credit card receivables, and collateralized loan obligations backed by portfolios of senior loans. The various tranches of these securities have repayment priorities ranging from senior to junior, and thus varying levels of riskiness. The assets backing the junior tranches render the seniors over-collateralized, and the capital from buyers of the lower-yielding senior tranches levers up the potential returns to the holders of the junior tranches. These structured debt securities are particularly complex, and it was mostly underestimation of the riskiness of subprime mortgage-backed securities that led to the global financial crisis. When below-investment-grade bonds began to be publicly issued in the 1970s, they usually carried covenants, representations from or limitations on the issuers that would protect bondholders from potentially deleterious actions on the issuer's part. But investors became more comfortable with risky debt over the years, and more recently, heavy inflows of capital created a seller's market in which investors were forced to compete for the opportunity to provide financing by accepting lower yields or increased risk. In the process, covenants are mostly gone from new loans, meaning lenders came to enjoy less protection. Before I leave the topic of changes we've seen, I want to mention one of the most significant: the downtrend in interest rates that has prevailed over the working lives of most of today's investors. In the 1970s, I took out a personal loan from a bank at 3/4 over prime, and I framed the slip from 1980 notifying me that the interest rate had risen to 22.25%. 40 years later, in 2020, I was able to borrow at 2%. The 2,000 basis point decline in rates was the result of the low level of inflation over the period. Because lower rates mean higher discounted values for future cash flows and less competition from bonds against other assets, enhancing the value of the latter, this rate decline was a massive tailwind behind the returns enjoyed by all investors, not just those in fixed income. We saw the return of inflation in 2021 to 2022 and corresponding drops in the prices of bonds and most other assets. Readers in future years will know more about the continuation of this trend and its ramifications than I do as of this writing. Finally, if you wanted to keep abreast of the fixed income markets, you had to constantly learn new terminology. I'm confident Graham and Dodd would have no idea what today's investors are saying. I'm long duration, meaning the duration of my portfolio is longer than average, meaning I'm betting that interest rates will fall and bond prices will rise. I'm short spreads, meaning I believe the spread by which the yield on high-yield bonds exceeds the yield on Treasury bonds, which results from perceived corporate credit risk, will increase in the future. That means the prices of risky bonds will fall. I'm long credit, meaning my bond portfolio is overweighted in corporate bonds relative to government bonds, meaning I think positive trends in economic growth and corporate profits will cause corporates to outperform. I trade rates, meaning I deal in government debt and anything related to it, such as inflation-indexed bonds, futures, forwards, options, swaps, and swaptions. Don't ask. Looking back, I was exceptionally fortunate to participate in the credit markets over the last 45 years and to have benefited, first, from the emergence of markets most others failed to capitalize on, and second, from the popularization of these markets after I found them and staked my position. The result has been steady employment and untold intellectual satisfaction. In dealing with these emergent markets, with their appearance of riskiness, my Oak Tree partners and I chose to build a firm that would emphasize risk control, consistency, long-term investment, and limits on the amount of capital we would manage. We also insisted on creating a culture that would emphasize these things. In sum, we tried to offer a low-risk option, giving clients a way to participate with less than full risk. Our motto at Oak Tree's founding was, if we avoid the losers, the winners will take care of themselves. And that remains our lodestar, putting a high priority on risk consciousness even now that we've added a number of aspirational strategies that demand that winners be found. We've made only modest claims regarding what our results would be in good times. After all, everyone makes a lot of money in good times, and I've never understood the need for outperformance in good times, given that pursuing it usually requires an investor to carry above-average risk. Instead, we've emphasized outperformance in bad times. It's really then that outperformance is essential. It's also in bad times, usually marked by large number of defaults, that selectivity and highly proficient credit research can best add value through the avoidance of holdings that are negatively affected. Another way in which I've been fortunate was to have been an investor in credit over the course of the 40-year, 2,000 basis point decline of interest rates and the resulting bull market in credit assets. I didn't do anything to produce that bull market, and I didn't foresee it. I was merely in the right market at the right time. But the salutary impact of declining interest rates must not be underestimated or the resulting returns misattributed. When I look back at the period in which my partners and I have invested, we could have been more aggressive than we were. We could have taken more risk. We could have actively pursued more winners and taken a chance on more iffy credits. We could have put more faith in the Fed to keep the economy growing and the markets aloft. Given how benign the investment climate turned out to be in this period overall, doing these things may well have led to higher returns. I'm unlikely to get a chance to find out if they will constitute a winning approach for the years ahead, however, as Oaktree isn't likely to change its spots in this regard. Prevailing conditions truly have combined to make the last 45 years in the credit market the best of times. Credit investors have benefited from economic growth, declining default rates, low inflation, the downtrend in interest rates, and the increased popularity of credit assets. Will the coming years be as kind? There's no way to know. But I think we can all agree that we're unlikely to see much more in the way of interest rate declines given today's historic lows, meaning there won't be a significant tailwind from that source. In addition, the credit market, like most others, is now much more efficient, meaning it'll be harder to find as many bargains as we did in the past. As I say in response to most questions about the macro future, we'll see. The market for debt securities, like all aspects of investing, and in fact most areas of human endeavor, has evolved greatly and is sure to continue to do so. How-to books written to treat the questions of the day may be immediately helpful, but they're unlikely to remain relevant for long. On the other hand, the 1940 edition of Security Analysis contains wisdom for the ages, applicable at the time it was written as well as today and tomorrow. Importantly, it shows the reader how to think about investing, which is more valuable than what to think. I'm sure it will remain a Bible of investing for years to come. Chapter 6. The Selection of Fixed Value Investments. Having suggested a classification of securities by character rather than by title, we now take up in order the principles and methods of selection applicable to each group. We have already stated that the fixed value group includes 1. High-grade straight bonds and preferred stocks. 2. High-grade privileged issues where the value of the privilege is too remote to count as a factor in selection. 3. Common stocks which, through guarantee or preferred status, occupy the position of a high-grade senior issue. Basic attitude toward high-grade preferred stocks. By placing gilt-edged preferred stocks and high-grade bonds in a single group, we indicate that the same investment attitude and the same general method of analysis are applicable to both types. The very definite inferiority of the preferred stockholder's legal claim is here left out of account for the logical reason that the soundness of the best investments must rest not upon legal rights or remedies, but upon ample financial capacity of the enterprise. Confirmation of this viewpoint is found in the investor's attitude toward such an issue as National Biscuit Company Preferred, which for nearly 40 years has been considered as possessing the same essential investment character as a good bond. Preferred stocks not generally equivalent to bonds in investment merit. But it should be pointed out immediately that issues with the history and standing of National Biscuit Preferred constitute a very small percentage of all preferred stocks. Hence, we are by no means asserting the investment equivalence of bonds and preferred stocks in general. On the contrary, we shall, in a later chapter, be at some pains to show that the average preferred issue deserves a lower rank than the average bond, and furthermore that preferred stocks have been much too readily accepted by the investing public. The majority of these issues have not been sufficiently well protected to assure continuance of dividends beyond any reasonable doubt. They belong properly, therefore, in the class of variable or speculative senior issues, Group 2, and in this field the contractual differences between bonds and preferred shares are likely to assume great importance. A sharp distinction must, therefore, be made between the typical and the exceptional preferred stock. It is only the latter which deserves to rank as a fixed value investment and to be viewed in the same light as a good bond. To avoid awkwardness of expression in this discussion, we shall frequently use the terms investment bonds or merely bonds to represent all securities belonging to the fixed value class. Is bond investment logical? In the 1934 edition of this work, we considered with some seriousness the question whether or not the extreme financial and industrial fluctuations of the preceding years had not impaired the fundamental logic of bond investment. Was it worthwhile for the investor to limit his income return and to forego all prospect of speculative gain, if, despite these sacrifices, he must still subject himself to serious risk of loss? We suggested in reply that the phenomena of 1927 through 1933 were so completely abnormal as to afford no fair basis for investment theory and practice. Subsequent experience seems to have borne us out, but there are still enough uncertainties facing the bond buyer to banish, perhaps for a long time, his old sense of complete security. The combination of a record high level for bonds in 1940, with a history of 2 catastrophic price collapses in the preceding 20 years and a major war in progress, is not one to justify airy confidence in the future. Bond form inherently unattractive. Quantitative assurance of safety essentials. This situation clearly calls for a more critical and exacting attitude towards bond selection than was formerly considered necessary by investors, issuing houses, or authors of textbooks on investment. Allusion has already been made to the dangers inherent in the acceptance of the bond form as an assurance of safety, or even of smaller risk than is found in stocks. Instead of associating bonds primarily with the presumption of safety, as has long been the practice, it would be sounder to start with what is not presumption but fact, viz., that a straight bond is an investment with limited return. In exchange for limiting his participation in future profits, the bondholder obtains a prior claim and a definite promise of payment, while the preferred stockholder obtains only the priority without the promise. But neither priority nor promise is itself an assurance of payment. This assurance rests in the ability of the enterprise to fulfill its promise, and must be looked for in its financial position, record, and prospects. The essence of proper bond selection consists, therefore, in obtaining specific and convincing factors of safety in compensation for the surrender of participation in profits. Major emphasis on avoidance of loss. Our primary conception of the bond as a commitment with limited return leads us to another important viewpoint toward bond investment. Since the chief emphasis must be placed on avoidance of loss, bond selection is primarily a negative art. It is a process of exclusion and rejection rather than of search and acceptance. In this respect, the contrast with common stock selection is fundamental in character. The prospective buyer of a given common stock is influenced more or less equally by the desire to avoid loss and the desire to make a profit. The penalty for mistakenly rejecting the issue may conceivably be as great as that for mistakenly accepting it. But an investor may reject any number of good bonds with virtually no penalty at all, provided he does not eventually accept an unsound issue. Hence, broadly speaking, there is no such thing as being unduly captious or exacting in the purchase of fixed-value investments. The observation that Walter Bagehot addressed to commercial bankers is equally applicable to the selection of investment bonds. Is there a difficulty or a doubt the security should be declined? 4 principles for the selection of issues of the fixed-value type. Having established this general approach to our problem, we may now state 4 additional principles of more specific character which are applicable to the selection of individual issues. 1. Safety is measured not by specific lien or other contractual rights, but by the ability of the issuer to meet all of its obligations. 2. This ability should be measured under conditions of depression rather than prosperity. 3. Deficient safety cannot be compensated for by an abnormally high coupon rate. 4. The selection of all bonds for investment should be subject to rules of exclusion and to specific quantitative tests corresponding to those prescribed by statute to govern investments of savings banks. A technique of bond selection based on the above principles will differ in significant respects from the traditional attitude and methods. In departing from old concepts, however, this treatment represents not an innovation, but the recognition and advocacy of viewpoints which have been steadily gaining ground among intelligent and experienced investors. The ensuing discussion is designed to make clear both the nature and the justification of the newer ideas. 1. Safety not measured by lien, but by ability to pay. The basic difference confronts us at the very beginning. In the past, the primary emphasis was laid upon the specific security, that is, the character and supposed value of the property on which the bonds hold a lien. From our standpoint, this consideration is quite secondary. The dominant element must be the strength and soundness of the obligor enterprise. There is here a clear-cut distinction between 2 points of view. On the one hand, the bond is regarded as a claim against property. On the other hand, as a claim against a business. The older view is logical enough in its origin and purpose. It desired to make the bondholder independent of the risks of the business by giving him ample security on which to levy in the event that the enterprise proved a failure. If the business became unable to pay his claim, he could take over the mortgaged property and pay himself out of that. This arrangement would be excellent if it worked, but in practice it rarely proves to be feasible. For this, there are 3 reasons. 1. The shrinkage of property values when the business fails. 2. The difficulty of asserting the bondholder's supposed legal rights. 3. The delays and other disadvantages incident to a receivership. Lien is no guarantee against shrinkage of values. The conception of a mortgage lien as a guarantee of protection independent of the success of the business itself is, in most cases, a complete fallacy. In the typical situation, the value of the pledged property is vitally dependent on the earning power of the enterprise. The bondholder usually has a lien on a railroad line, or on factory buildings and equipment, or on power plants and other utility properties, or perhaps on a bridge or hotel structure. These properties are rarely adaptable to uses other than those for which they were constructed. Hence, if the enterprise proves a failure, its fixed assets ordinarily suffer an appalling shrinkage in realizable value. For this reason, the established practice of stating the original cost or appraised value of the pledged property as an inducement to purchase bonds is entirely misleading. The value of pledged assets assumes practical importance only in the event of default, and in any such event the book figures are almost invariably found to be unreliable and irrelevant. This may be illustrated by Seaboard All-Florida Railway First Mortgage 6s selling in 1931 at 1 cent on the dollar shortly after completion of the road. Impracticable to enforce basic legal rights of lien holder. In cases where the mortgaged property is actually worth as much as the debt, the bondholder is rarely allowed to take possession and realize upon it. It must be recognized that the procedure following default on a corporation bond has come to differ materially from that customary in the case of a mortgage on privately owned property. The basic legal rights of the lien holder are supposedly the same in both situations, but in practice we find a very definite disinclination on the part of the courts to permit corporate bondholders to take over properties by foreclosing on their liens, if there is any possibility that these assets may have a fair value in excess of their claim. Apparently, it is considered unfair to wipe out stockholders or junior bondholders who have a potential interest in the property but are not in a position to protect it. As a result of this practice, bondholders rarely, if ever, come into actual possession of the pledged property unless its value at the time is substantially less than their claim. In most cases, they are required to take new securities in a reorganized company. Sometimes the default in interest is cured and the issue reinstated. On exceedingly rare occasions, a defaulted issue may be paid off in full, but only after a long and vexing delay. Delays are wearisome. This delay constitutes the third objection to relying upon the mortgaged property as protection for a bond investment. The more valuable the pledged assets in relation to the amount of the lien, the more difficult it is to take them over under foreclosure, and the longer the time required to work out an equitable division of interest among the various bond and stock issues. Let us consider the most favorable kind of situation for a bondholder in the event of receivership. He would hold a comparatively small first mortgage followed by a substantial junior lien, the requirements of which have made the company insolvent. It may well be that the strength of the first mortgage bondholder's position is such that at no time is there any real chance of eventual loss to him. Yet the financial difficulties of the company usually have a depressing effect on the market price of all its securities, even those presumably unimpaired in real value. As the receivership drags on, the market decline becomes accentuated, since investors are constitutionally averse to buying into a troubled situation. Eventually, the first mortgage bonds may come through the reorganization undisturbed, but during a wearisome and protracted period, the owners have faced a severe impairment in the quoted value of their holdings, and at least some degree of doubt and worry as to the outcome. Typical examples of such an experience can be found in the case of Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway Company First Fours and Brooklyn Union Elevated Railroad First Fives. The subject of receivership and reorganization practice, particularly as they affect the bondholder, will receive more detailed consideration in a later chapter. Basic principle is to avoid trouble. The foregoing discussion should support our emphatic stand that the primary aim of the bond buyer must be to avoid trouble and not to protect himself in the event of trouble. Even in the cases where the specific lien proves of real advantage, this benefit is realized under conditions which contravene the very meaning of fixed value investment. In view of the severe decline in market price almost invariably associated with receivership, the mere fact that the investor must have recourse to his indenture indicates that his investment has been unwise or unfortunate. The protection that the mortgaged property offers him can constitute at best a mitigation of his mistake. Corollaries from this first principle. 1. Absence of lien of minor consequence. From Principle 1 there follow a number of corollaries with important practical applications. Since specific lien is of subordinate importance in the choice of high-grade bonds, the absence of lien is also of minor consequence. The debenture, that is, unsecured obligations of a strong corporation amply capable of meeting its interest charges, may qualify for acceptance almost as readily as a bond secured by mortgage. Furthermore, the debentures of a strong enterprise are undoubtedly sounder investments than the mortgage issues of a weak company. No first lien bond, for example, enjoys a better investment rating than Standard Oil of New Jersey Debenture 3s due 1961. An examination of the bond list will show that the debenture issues of companies having no secured debt ahead of them will rank in investment character at least on a par with the average mortgage bond, because an enterprise must enjoy a high credit rating to obtain funds on its unsecured long-term bond. 2. The theory of buying the highest yielding obligation of a sound company. It follows also that if any obligation of an enterprise deserves to qualify as a fixed value investment, then all its obligations must do so. Stated conversely, if a company's junior bonds are not safe, its first mortgage bonds are not a desirable fixed value investment. For if the second mortgage is unsafe, the company itself is weak, and generally speaking, there can be no high-grade obligations of a weak enterprise. The theoretically correct procedure for bond investment, therefore, is first to select a company meeting every test of strength and soundness, and then to purchase its highest yielding obligation, which would usually mean its junior rather than its first lien bonds. Assuming no error were ever made in our choice of enterprises, this procedure would work out perfectly well in practice. The greater the chance of mistake, however, the more reason to sacrifice yield in order to reduce the potential loss in capital value. But we must recognize that in favoring the lower-yielding first mortgage issue, the bond buyer is in fact expressing a lack of confidence in his own judgment as to the soundness of the business, which, if carried far enough, would call into question the advisability of his making an investment in any of the bonds of the particular enterprise. Example: As an example of this point, let us consider the Cudahy Packing Company First Mortgage 5s, due 1946, and the debenture 5.5s of the same company, due 1937. In June 1932, the first 5s sold at 95 to yield about 5.5%, whereas the junior 5.5s sold at 59 to yield over 20% to maturity. The purchase of the 5% bonds at close to par could only be justified by a confident belief that the company would remain solvent and reasonably prosperous, for otherwise the bonds would undoubtedly suffer a severe drop in market price. But if the investor has confidence in the future of Cudahy, why should he not buy the debenture issue and obtain an enormously greater return on his money? The only answer can be that the investor wants the superior protection of the first mortgage in the event his judgment proves incorrect and the company falls into difficulties. In that case, he would probably lose less as the owner of the first mortgage bonds than through holding the junior issue. Even on this score, it should be pointed out that if by any chance Cudahy Packing Company were to suffer the reverses that befell Fisk Rubber Company, the loss in market value of the first mortgage bonds would be fully as great as those suffered by the debentures. For in April 1932, Fisk Rubber Company first 8s were selling as low as 17 against a price of 12 for the unsecured 5.5% notes. It is clear at any rate that the investor who favors the Cudahy first lien 5s is paying a premium of about 15% per annum, the difference in yield, for only a partial insurance against loss. On this basis, he is undoubtedly giving up too much for what he gets in return. The conclusion appears inescapable either that he should make no investment in Cudahy bonds or that he should buy the junior issue at its enormously higher yield. This rule may be laid down as applying to the general case where a first mortgage bond sells at a fixed value price, for example, close to par, and junior issues of the same company can be bought to yield a much higher return. 3. Senior liens are to be favored, unless junior obligations offer a substantial advantage. Obviously, a junior lien should be preferred only if the advantage in income return is substantial. Where the first mortgage bond yields only slightly less, it is undoubtedly wise to pay the small insurance premium for protection against unexpected trouble. Example: this point is illustrated by the relative market prices of Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company General First 4s and Adjustment Second Mortgage 4s, both of which mature in 1995. Prior to 1924, the Atchison General 4s sold usually at about 7 to 10 points above the Adjustment 4s and yielded about 0.5% less. Since both issues were considered safe without question, it would have been more logical to purchase the junior issue at its 10% lower cost. After 1923, this point of view asserted itself, and the price difference steadily narrowed. During 1930 and part of 1931, the junior issue sold on numerous occasions at practically the same price as the General 4s. This relationship was even more illogical than the unduly wide spread in 1922 to 1923, since the advantage of the Adjustment 4s in price and yield was too negligible to warrant accepting a junior position, even assuming unquestioned safety for both liens. Within a very short time, this rather obvious truth was brought home strikingly by the widening of the spread to over 14 points during the demoralized bond market conditions of June 1932. As the record appeared in 1934, it could be inferred that a reasonable differential between the two issues would be about 5 points, and that either a substantial widening or virtual disappearance of the spread would present an opportunity for a desirable exchange of one issue for another. Two such opportunities did in fact appear in 1934 and 1936, as shown in our table. But this example is of further utility in illustrating the all-pervasive factor of change and the necessity of taking it into account in bond analysis. By 1937, the failure of Atchison's earnings to recover within striking distance of its former normal and the actual inadequacy of the margin above interest requirements as judged by conservative standards should have warned the investor that the adjustment, that is, contingent element in the junior issue could not safely be ignored. Thus, a price relationship that was logical at a time when safety of interest was never in question could not be relied upon under the new conditions. In 1938, the poor earnings actually compelled the road to defer the May 1st interest payment on the adjustment bonds, as a result of which their price fell to 75 1/4 and the spread widened to 24 points. Although the interest was later paid in full and the price recovered to 96 in 1939, it would seem quite unwise for the investor to apply pre-1932 standards to this bond issue. A junior lien of Company X may be selected in preference to a first mortgage bond of Company Y on one of two bases. 1. The protection for the total debt of Company X is adequate and the yield of the junior lien is substantially higher than that of the Company Y issue, or 2. If there is no substantial advantage in yield, then the indicated protection for the total debt of Company X must be considerably better than that of Company Y. The appreciably higher coverage of total charges by American Gas and Electric would have justified preferring its junior bonds to the first mortgage issue of Pacific Power and Light, when both were selling at about the same price. Special status of underlying bonds. In the railroad field, an especial investment character is generally supposed to attach to what are known as underlying bonds. These represent issues of relatively small size, secured by a lien on especially important parts of the obligor system, and often followed by a series of blanket mortgages. The underlying bond usually enjoys a first lien, but it may be a second or even a third mortgage issue, provided the senior issues are also of comparatively small magnitude. Example: New York and Erie Railroad third mortgage extended 4 1/2 due 1938 are junior to two small prior liens covering an important part of the Erie Railroad's main line. They are followed by 4 successive blanket mortgages on the system, and they have regularly enjoyed the favored status of an underlying bond. Bonds of this description have been thought to be entirely safe, regardless of what happens to the system as a whole. They have almost always come through reorganization unscathed, and even during a receivership, interest payments are usually continued as a matter of course, largely because the sum involved is proportionately so small. They are not exempt, however, from fairly sharp declines in market value if insolvency overtakes the system. Examples: in the case of New York and Erie third 4 1/2, which had been voluntarily extended on maturity in 1923 and again in 1933, principal and interest were defaulted in March 1938, following the bankruptcy of the Erie 2 months earlier. The bid price declined to as low as 61. However, the various reorganization plans filed to the end of 1939 all provided for the payment of principal and interest in full on this issue. Chicago and Eastern Illinois Consolidated Sixes, due 1934, were finally paid off in full in 1940 with further interest at 4%, but not until their price had fallen as low as 32 in 1933. Pacific Railway of Missouri First Fours and Second Fives and Missouri Pacific Railway Third Fours, all extended from their original maturities to 1938, are underlying bonds of the Missouri Pacific system. They continued to receive interest and were left undisturbed in the receivership of 1915. Following the second bankruptcy in 1933, they continued to receive interest until their maturity date. At that time, payment of principal was defaulted, but interest payments were continued through 1939. The various reorganization plans virtually provided for these bonds in full by offering them prior lien, fixed interest obligations of the new company. But since 1931, the price of these three issues has been as low as 65, 60, and 53, respectively. Other bonds, however, once regarded as underlying issues, have not fared so well following insolvency. Example: Milwaukee, Sparta, and Northwestern First Fours, due 1947, ranked as an underlying bond of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, and for many years their price was not far below that of the premier Union Pacific First Fours due the same year. Yet the receivership of the Chicago and Northwestern was followed by default of interest on this issue in 1935 and collapse of its price to the abysmal low of 8 1/8 as late as 1939. From the foregoing, it would appear that, in some cases, underlying bonds may be viewed as exceptions to our rule that a bond is not sound unless the company is sound. For the most part, such bonds are owned by institutions or large investors. The same observations may apply to certain first mortgage bonds of operating subsidiaries of public utility holding company systems. In railroad bonds of this type, the location and strategic value of the mileage covered are of prime importance. First mortgage bonds on non-essential and unprofitable parts of the system, referred to sometimes as divisional liens, are not true underlying bonds in the sense that we have just used the term. Divisional first liens on poorly located mileage may receive much less favorable treatment in a reorganization than blanket mortgage bonds ostensibly junior to them. Example: Central Branch Union Pacific Railway First Fours, due 1938, were said to underlie the Missouri Pacific First and Refunding Mortgage, which provided for their retirement. Yet the reorganization plans presented to the end of 1939 all offered better treatment for the Missouri Pacific First and Refunding Fives than for the ostensibly senior Central Branch bonds. As a practical matter, it is not so easy to distinguish in advance between the underlying bonds that come through reorganization unscathed and those which suffer drastic treatment. Hence, the ordinary investor may be well advised to leave such issues out of his calculations and stick to the rule that only strong companies have strong bonds. Chapter 7. The Selection of Fixed Value Investments, Second and Third Principles. 2. Bonds should be bought on a depression basis. The rule that a sound investment must be able to withstand adversity seems self-evident enough to be termed a truism. Any bond can do well when conditions are favorable. It is only under the acid test of depression that the advantages of strong over weak issues become manifest and vitally important. For this reason, prudent investors have always favored the obligations of old established enterprises which have demonstrated their ability to come through bad times as well as good. Presumption of safety based upon either the character of the industry or the amount of protection. Confidence in the ability of a bond issue to weather depression may be based on either of two different reasons. The investor may believe that the particular business will be immune from a drastic shrinkage in earning power, or else that the margin of safety is so large that it can undergo such a shrinkage without resultant danger. The bonds of light and power companies have been favored principally for the first reason, the bonds of United States Steel Corporation subsidiaries for the second. In the former case, it is the character of the industry. In the latter, it is the amount of protection, which justifies the purchase. Of the two viewpoints, the one which tries to avoid the perils of depression appeals most to the average bond buyer. It seems much simpler to invest in a depression-proof enterprise than to have to rely on the company's financial strength to pull its bonds through a period of poor results. No industry entirely depression-proof. The objection to this theory of investment is, of course, that there is no such thing as a depression-proof industry, meaning thereby one that is immune from the danger of any decline in earning power. It is true that the Edison companies have shown themselves subject to only minor shrinkage in profits as compared, say, with the steel producers. But even a small decline may prove fatal if the business is bonded to the limit of prosperity earnings. Once it is admitted, as it always must be, that the industry can suffer some reduction in profits, then the investor is compelled to estimate the possible extent of the shrinkage and compare it with the surplus above the interest requirements. He thus finds himself in the same position as the holder of any other kind of bond. vitally concerned with the ability of the company to meet the vicissitudes of the future. The distinction to be made, therefore, is not between industries which are exempt from and those which are affected by depression, but rather between those which are more and those which are less subject to fluctuation. The more stable the type of enterprise, the better suited it is to bond financing, and the larger the portion of the supposed normal earning power which may be consumed by interest charges. As the degree of instability increases, it must be offset by a greater margin of safety to make sure that interest charges will be met. In other words, a smaller portion of total capital may be represented by bonds. If there is such a lack of inherent stability as to make survival of the enterprise doubtful under continued unfavorable conditions, a question arising frequently in the case of industrial companies of secondary size, then the bond issue cannot meet the requirements of fixed value investment, even though the margin of safety, measured by past performance, may be exceedingly large. Such a bond will meet the quantitative but not the qualitative test, but both are essential to our concept of investment. Investment practice recognizes importance of character of the industry. This conception of diverse margins of safety has been solidly grounded in investment practice for many years. The threefold classification of enterprises, as railroads, public utilities, or industrials, was intended to reflect inherent differences in relative stability and, consequently, in the coverage to be required above bond interest requirements. Investors thought well, for example, of any railroad which earned its bond interest twice over. But the same margin in the case of an industrial bond was ordinarily regarded as inadequate. In the decade between 1920 and 1930, the status of the public utility division underwent some radical changes. A sharp separation was introduced between light, heat, and power services on the one hand, and street railway lines on the other, although previously the two had been closely allied. The trolley companies, because of their poor showing, were tacitly excluded from the purview of the term public utility, as used in financial circles, and in the popular mind, the name was restricted to electric, gas, water, and telephone companies. Later on, promoters endeavored to exploit the popularity of the public utilities by applying this title to companies engaged in all sorts of businesses, including natural gas, ice, coal, and even storage. The steady progress of the utility group, even in the face of the minor industrial setbacks of 1924 and 1927, led to an impressive advance in its standing among investors, so that by 1929 it enjoyed a credit rating fully on a par with the railroads. In the ensuing depression, it registered a much smaller shrinkage in gross and net earnings than did the transportation industry, and it seems logical to expect that bonds of soundly capitalized light and power companies will replace high-grade railroad bonds as the premier type of corporate investment. This seems true to the authors despite the distinct recession in the popularity of utility bonds and stocks since 1933, due to a combination of rate reductions, governmental competition, and threatened dangers from inflation. Depression performance as a test of merit. Let us turn our attention now to the behavior of these three investment groups in the two recent depression tests, that of 1931 through 1933 and that of 1937 to 1938. Of these, the former was of such unexampled severity that it may seem unfair and impractical to ask that any investment now under consideration should be measured by its performance in those disastrous times. We have felt, however, that the experiences of 1931 through 1933 may be profitably viewed as a laboratory test of investment standards, involving degrees of stress not to be expected in the ordinary vicissitudes of the future. Even though the conditions prevalent in those years may not be duplicated, the behavior of various types of securities at the time should throw a useful light on investment problems. Various causes of bond collapses. 1. Excessive funded debt of utilities. If we study the bond issues which suffered collapse in the post-bubble period, we shall observe that different causes underlay the troubles of each group. The public utility defaults were caused not by a disappearance of earnings, but by the inability of overextended debt structures to withstand a relatively moderate setback. Enterprises capitalized on a reasonably sound basis, as judged by former standards, had little difficulty in meeting bond interest. This did not hold true in the case of many holding companies with pyramided capital structures, which had absorbed nearly every dollar of peak year earnings for fixed charges and so had scarcely any margin available to meet a shrinkage in profits. The widespread difficulties of the utilities were due not to any weakness in the light and power business, but to the reckless extravagance of its financing methods. The losses of investors in public utility bonds could, for the most part, have been avoided by the exercise of ordinary prudence in bond selection. Conversely, the unsound financing methods employed must eventually have resulted in individual collapses, even in the ordinary course of the business cycle. In consequence, the theory of investment in sound public utility bonds appears in no sense to have been undermined by 1931 through 1933 experience. 2. Stability of railroad earnings overrated. Turning to the railroads, we find a somewhat different situation. Here, the fault appears to be that the stability of the transportation industry was overrated, so that investors were satisfied with a margin of protection which proved insufficient. It was not a matter of imprudently disregarding old established standards of safety, as in the case of the weaker utilities, but rather of being content with old standards when conditions called for more stringent requirements. Looking back, we can see that the failure of the carriers generally to increase their